Support for this episode comes from TVNU, Building Justice. For recent high school grads, the TVNU Gap Year offers hands-on internships for social change, adventures in the stunning Pacific Northwest, and friendships that last a lifetime. Participants build a vibrant and inclusive Jewish home together in Portland, Oregon. Gain confidence, make an impact, and discover your voice before even stepping onto a college campus. Robust financial aid is available. Apply now at tivnu.org. Email Miriam Grossman at miriam@tvnu.org to learn more.
This is Judaism Unbound, episode 478, Passover in 2025. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And because of the realities of the Jewish calendar, we're taking a quick break from our series of episodes exploring American Jewish discourse on Israel-Palestine for an episode thinking about Passover, because Passover starts tomorrow as this episode is released. And by the way, if you want even more Passover content after you listen to this, last week's episode with Amichai Levi also closed with some Passover thoughts, and we've done a lot of episodes on Passover over the years, and you can find them all very conveniently at our website, judaismunbound.com/Passover-episodes. As we've discussed before, we think that the holidays are supposed to change us in some way, that ideally we come away from them a little bit different from how we came into them. But we also know how rare it is for that to actually happen. So we're always interested in talking to smart people, soulful people who are doing things a little bit differently. And today we're speaking with two good friends who have done some really pretty interesting experimentation with Passover. But before we dive into that part of the conversation, just a very quick reminder that a new batch of 3-week mini courses in the Yeshiva is going to begin just after Passover ends. That's only about a week and a half away. So you can learn about any of them at judaismunbound.com/classes. There's some really great ones, and financial aid is available for all Yeshiva classes. So don't let the cost be an obstacle if you're interested in learning about the subjects that we're offering this time around. So go check it out at judaismunbound.com/classes. We don't really have to set up our conversation too much more. It's about Passover. So we're just going to give you a little bit more introduction of our guest today and get right into it. Our first guest, Daniel Spiro, is my colleague at Lippman Camphor Foundation for Living Torah, where his official title is Director of Communications, but where he works in all kinds of ways to expand the world of Jewish content that helps regular Jews like us access powerful, relevant, and practical Jewish wisdom. Daniel Spiro is also an essayist and fiction writer who's been published by The New Yorker, among other places. You can find some of his work, including a downloadable version of his immersive democratic Haggadah, which we're going to be talking about today, on his Substack, Living Torah. That's living, then T, parentheses, A, close parens, O-R-A-H. Long story, you should read it as Tao and Torah. Our second guest, Marques Hollie, has been a guest on the podcast before. He's an operatically trained vocalist, ritual leader, and theater maker who believes that Jewish practice and ritual are expansive, resilient containers. Marques Hollie enjoys exploring their identities as a queer Black Jewish person through original songs and nigunim, liturgy, and theatrical work. Following a 2-year course of study, Marques Hollie received ordination as a Magid, a sacred storyteller, and is now a rabbinical student at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, as well as a Cooperberg Ritmaster rabbinical intern at Congregation Beit Simchat Torah in New York City. Marques Hollie is also on the program faculty at Let My People Sing and serves with me on the board of Svara, a traditionally radical yeshiva. So let's jump right into this conversation and do some thinking about how to make our Passover experience more powerful this year. Daniel Spiro, Marques Hollie, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
Lovely to be here.
Great to be here.
So I have been on a rant for probably way too many years now, and I'm not sure that our listeners really want to hear it again. But I thought that it might be helpful to just state it a little bit and see if maybe you can help us think about basically how to make Passover better at its job. Because my feeling is that basically we have this Seder technology, and in some ways it's a really good technology. And people are like, oh, let's have a Seder for other holidays. Let's have a Seder for Tu B'Shvat, and let's have a Seder for Rosh Hashanah. And so there's something about a Seder that people like. And yet, my experience is that, and I've said this before, I think, that in my experience, the Seder is kind of like a cookbook. And once upon a time, long ago, we used to cook an amazing meal and make amazing cakes. And somehow, over the decades and over the centuries, the practice stopped being making the wonderful meal and making the wonderful cakes, and instead sitting around a table reading a cookbook. And reading the cookbook is different from eating the meal. And I have this sense that something is deeply missing from our Passover experience, which is not the Passover meal, because usually we do eat the Passover meal. I just want to be clear that I'm talking about a metaphor, that the meal of the Seder experience, that something is supposed to be happening, that the Haggadah, which we have and which we read from, is only meant to be a kind of it's not meant to be a script. It's meant to be the ingredients. It's meant to help push us in the right direction. But ultimately, something more than that should be happening. And for most of us, it's not happening. And frankly, I blame Maxwell House because they made the Haggadah really cheap and made Jews able to have many of them in their house. And naturally, at some point, people
How
are just
dare they make it accessible? No, I hear you.
No, but they made it too accessible. Somehow people said, let's just go around and read it. Hey, you read a paragraph, you read a paragraph. And I don't want to throw shade on people who do that and find meaning in it. But I'm just imagining that, first of all, it was not the tradition. We know it wasn't the tradition to do this. It couldn't have been because Jews couldn't afford to have Haggadahs in their houses. So it can't be the tradition, the original tradition, to read out of a book. And yet that is so much what it has become that most people listening to this assume, like, what else could it possibly be? So we wanted to have you on because both of you have done things that are a little different from that. And we wanted to start with having you describe a little bit what you've done. So, Marques, let's start with you. And could you just tell us a little bit about your alternative take, both what you've done and maybe why you did it?
Absolutely. I'm happy to, Dan. So as a musician, theater artist, ritual practitioner, all of those nouns and em dashes that go together to string some sort of creative identity, I created a show called Godan Moshe, which is essentially a monodrama or one-person show that looks at the narrative of Passover, bondage into liberation, and then the ongoing sort of struggle for freedom, and reimagines that in a very Black American specifically centric lens by looking at the Passover story through the narratives of formerly enslaved people in the United States and having those texts, those firsthand experiences alongside the more traditional understanding of Passover, and also infusing that with the music of Negro spirituals, as well as civil rights era music to create a new, I don't want to say a new expression of Passover, but something that feels much more personal and much more visceral as a person who inhabits both Jewish and Black American identity. And so for Good on Moshe, it is a theater show. There are recordings of it on YouTube and sort of clips here and there, but what's been interesting and a lot of fun actually is taking excerpts of it and weaving those into Passover Seders. So for example, there's a piece in the show called This Night, which is a play on, Manish Shana, how is this night different from all other nights? It's still in the show, but I've taken that and just excerpted it and used it in Passover Seder to say, look, okay, how does this go as a Manish Shana for other people? So it's both a theater work and also has excerptable pieces that can be used in the ritual itself.
All right, Daniel, let's get some description from you, perhaps a little more of a cerebral approach.
Maybe. We'll find out. So in my family, in our Seders, we, for a lot of years, have been adding readings, adding pieces for exactly the reason you just ranted about, Dan, which is that this sense of let's recite this script, let's fulfill this obligation, feels at odds with what I think the task of the Seder is, which is to make us think about what it means to be free. That we have this time on the calendar of Passover, 7 or 8 days, in which our invitation is to really, in a deep way, consider freedom. That's a vague ask. In my family, for a lot of years, we just kind of defaulted to asking that question. We would do the recitation and we'd say, so how do you feel about freedom? and it's not so useful. So for a long time, we were just sort of adding readings people would find in the family, and that kept it a little bit live, but still, it just didn't feel like we were getting there. So I had this idea last year to try to infuse a little bit of play into our Seder. We, as human beings, tend to either be working or playing or resting, and there's an opportunity with play to engage more deeply and personally with the things that we're talking about. The piece that really clicked for me, and this is, so I created a Haggadah, a new Haggadah that we used for the first time last year, was that, so in the Haggadah, we say that in every generation, a person should see themselves as if they left Mitzrayim, as if they left Egypt, and they were at Mount Sinai. And I think this is like a beautiful provocation, like to put ourselves back in the story. And the thought I had was, there was a generation in the story that left Egypt that was at Sinai, and that's actually not the same generation that went into the Promised Land. We have this story of the spies and the kind of failure of the spies to rouse the people into excitement about entering the Promised Land. And then there's this, in the text, it's a punishment that the people are meant to wander for 40 years, and it's actually the next generation that enters the Promised Land. And this to me felt like a key piece of the story to really sit with for a long time, that it's the generation that was not in Egypt, that did not know slavery, that goes into the Promised Land. Here is this generation of people who are being asked to do this thing, to fulfill this mission of their parents and grandparents, and they don't know the bad part. They don't know what they're escaping. So I imagine, what if we in the Seder really tried to embody that generation? So I made this Haggadah where I asked everyone to imagine ourselves as the second generation after Egypt. We didn't know slavery ourselves. We've been given this direction to go into the Holy Land, but we don't have to. We're in the wilderness or the desert, and we can keep wandering. This has become our home. This is where many of us were born. Or we can fulfill this direction and go into the Promised Land. The Haggadah that I made then sort of goes through the steps still of the traditional Seder, but with each one, there is another piece of the story. And so the ask, kind of the game of it, is let's retell our story, starting at the beginning with creation, the story that we've been handed down by our parents and grandparents, and figure out, what do we do together? We're free here already. Do we go into the land? If we do, why are we going into the land? If we don't, why aren't we going into the land? I included a decision-making process that was basically a kind of Robert's Rules of Order, democratic decision-making process. And that's kind of the premise of the Seder as we did it last year.
So that's really cool. I mean, both of the things that y'all have done, I'm really inspired by. I do want to zoom us out a little bit for a second. We'll get back into some of the specifics that y'all have done. But I am obsessed with Dan's cookbook analogy that, like, you know, we have this cookbook full of recipes, and at a certain point we stopped making recipes and we just started reading the cookbook. I've been using a similar kind of thing. I've been comparing Passover and the Passover Seder to the vault in gymnastics. What I've been saying is, like, it's as if people were, so the vault is the one where you jump on the little trampoline thing and it propels you upward, and then you do your thing on the vault, you do whatever trick, and then you hopefully land. And I've been comparing it to, like...
Well, you land. It's just a question of how you land.
Well, true. Hopefully, yeah, you land in some form. Hopefully you land on your 2 feet. But what I've been saying is, it's almost as if after a while we thought, wow, trampolines, vaults are, like, the actual process of jumping on that trampoline is really cool. We don't really need to bother with the actual trick you do on the vault. And what I mean by that is, like, the Haggadah to me is a springboard. It is a trampoline. Like, there's this misconception that the Seder, if you ask people what is the Seder, they'll be like, well, it has 14 parts, and it's this Kadesh Ruchatz, and there's these words that you say, and there's these actions you do. Like, the Seder is not the Haggadah. The Seder is not the set of words and actions prescribed in the Haggadah. That is the trampoline, or the launching point. The Seder is what is propelled forward by the Haggadah into the room. So all the conversation we have, all the questions we ask. And the example I'd give at this that shows how we've transformed the cookbook into a recipe manual that we read is the 4 questions. If you look at the Mishnah, if you look at Mishnah Pesachim, the section from which we get a number of things that are now part of the Seder, what it says is fascinating. It says, okay, here's the deal. You're going to get to a certain point in your collective meal, and the kids should ask questions. If the kids don't have questions ready yet, well, I guess you got to help and plant some sample questions. Here's the sample questions. And it gives one, why is this night different from all other nights? It actually only gives one question and then a bunch of answers. They're not really questions. But it gives the things that become the liturgy we now call the 4 questions. But that's actually a second best. Like, what we want is to just have questions. Like, that's what the Mishnah says, is just get the room going with questions and conversation. That's what the Seder is supposed to be. But we've thought somehow that the Seder is that recipe manual that, well, on this night, we eat matzah as opposed to bread and matzah. On this night, we have bitter, so all that's to say, I think we've lost the plot. I think we've lost, what is the Seder? And so I want to ask the two of you broadly, what is the Seder and what is it for? Why do we have them?
The question you're asking, I think, is really similar to what prompted me to make this Haggadah Lex. The way you describe the Haggadah as the springboard into questions is part of what I was trying to create, providing a situation that would invite people to see themselves in the story. And from that, so many questions naturally come up. And so we did do the 4 questions almost in exactly the way you described. Here's an example of questions. Some of the place that the Seder went awry, one of the reasons it went awry, is an over-deference to the rabbis. I actually cut out all reference to the rabbis from the Haggadah because the rabbis wouldn't have existed. They didn't exist.
In your generation, in your second generation, you mean?
Exactly. There were no rabbis. Now, I added a rule in kind of the spirit of the game that anyone was welcome to use their phone or any other device at the table to find an opinion from the rabbis if they wanted, but those opinions were not allowed to be authoritative. And I asked them to try to contextualize within the generation. So you could say, I had a great uncle who talked about how he and his friends sat around in a cave and told the story till daybreak. They had to take it out of the realm of, this is what we are supposed to do because the rabbis told us so, into the realm of, these were some wise elders who did a thing that maybe we can model and maybe we can learn from.
So what are Passover Seders for is a very interesting question. And in thinking about it, I'm sort of remembering the last bad Seder that I went to and what was actually bad about it. I will say the food did not do anyone any favor. So we're already starting from a deficit. The food was terrible. That Seder for me was devoid of connection. It was devoid of meaning. It was devoid of challenging us at the table to think about how we relate to this concept of freedom here in the 2020s. It was just this rote experience that gave a few people food poisoning, if I'm being quite honest about that. And so in thinking about that, it's for me, the Seder has to be about connection. If I'm not connecting to both the mythos of Passover as well as how that applies to my current situation or my current understanding of my life or our collective society, then what are we doing? To me, the Passover Seder is not supposed to be something that we just do to remember when we were enslaved in Egypt, but to really understand what it meant to go free from that and what does it mean to live now to continue going free from certain kinds of societal bondage. And if we can't make those connections through the Seder, then I question what we're doing when we have them.
Marques, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about Go Down Moshe and what's behind it. I'm curious how you have seen the interconnections between the Exodus story and the story of African Americans in the United States, but not in that way that I think a lot of people have made that connection for many, many years. But I guess my question is more about a person who embodies those two realities. What do you feel in your bones that one informs the other in a way that if they're not in dialogue with each other, then perhaps both are impoverished? And what might each have to gain from the other?
Yeah, happy to talk more about that. I think it's important for me to mention how the Good on Moshe thing even started. I was at a Seder with some friends. This was probably 10 years ago or so at this point. And we were using a Haggadah that was using the lens of like human trafficking as its sort of modern day societal issue, although human trafficking would have been a problem in biblical times too. And I remember being really struck by that and being really sort of awed by how we were able to take this technology and actually apply it to a contemporary issue or contemporary understanding. And that actually got me thinking, like, okay, well, Black folks were enslaved here for hundreds of years. Passover, clearly someone has already done this work of putting these two ideas together. I don't have to do this. And as I was doing Googling and some researching, I realized that what I had found, there were attempts, but nothing that felt like it really got at the central question or at the central idea, which to me became, what does spiritual, ancestral, metaphorical freedom mean to someone whose direct ancestry was in physical bondage within the last several hundred years in this country that I currently live in? I didn't set out to necessarily marry those two things in a really specific way. It was just, what does this look like and how does this feel? What I got from that process of starting to write this work was that this idea that we can silo ourselves, our identities, our lived experiences from our religious practice, from our spiritual practice, is a silly one. In order for me to fully inhabit my Jewishness, that meant also fully inhabiting my Blackness and my queerness and all of these other identities. And by doing that, by being able to put Blackness and chattel slavery at the center of a Passover story, at the center of a Passover narrative, became this transformative experience. I think I actually understood Judaism in a fundamentally different way after I started writing this show. Judaism requires all of me. And am I willing to give Judaism all of the pieces of my identity? And that was the first, I think, step in that process, writing the show.
I think for both of you, you're getting at something really pivotal about Passover. I mean, I'm sitting with the difference between, say, a classroom of students learning about the Revolutionary War or something versus a Revolutionary War reenactment where you dress up, you inhabit a character, and you line up and you do the whatever Revolutionary War thing. Like, I would argue pretty deeply that the Seder, as created, actually, I mean, we're here to say we should transcend the ways the Seder has been done in the past. But like, even as created, the Seder is more the enactment, it's more the reenactment than it is the like history lesson. Some rooms of people are asked, like, why do a Seder? I actually did this recently in a class I was teaching. People say stuff about like, well, we need to teach things from one generation to the next. It's a pedagogical exercise. And I think that's true. But what I think it is if we were going to give it a genre, it's experiential education. It's not instructor-student teaching in that form. It's we're going to actually inhabit a story together. And that we trust will shift how we think and how we do in the world. And it will also like teach us some things about the people we're part of. On the enactment point, I mean, I bring that up because, Daniel, that's the whole premise of yours. And Marques, when I read the description of Godan Moshe, it talks about like it's written in the first person, which to me, that's how one enacts. One shifts from third person, from he did this, she did this, they did this, to I did this, we did this. And that, of course, is the famous characteristic of this prayer. We were slaves in Egypt. Now we are free. Avadim hayinu. That's the new part is a we word. I'd love to just hear from the two of you. Like, maybe it's about Passover and maybe it's beyond just Passover. I actually think on one level, Passover is the closest we get to doing this the whole year. And so maybe we should praise it. But I think still, at most Seders, even good ones, I don't know how much of it we are really in enactment mode as opposed to distanced lesson or observer mode.
So what that makes me think about is a question I actually posed to the congregation that I'm an intern at about how do we remember something that didn't happen to us? And I got a lot of blank stares at first, which was like, okay, this is actually a strong start because there's a lot of words that I have to say after that. I think the Seder in its origins is actually really interesting because it, if I remember correctly, it started from this Greek sort of salon sort of idea where folks are just sort of lying around and lounging and reclining while all of these other things are happening while we're observing through this relaxation, right? And so think about it through that lens, it seems to me that the original satyrs, or sort of the first satyrs, were almost contrary, transgressive to this idea of reenacting. It was actually very literally like, no, like, let's lie down and be served. And understanding, of course, that the Haggadah came much later. But I think in terms of the Jewish ritual calendar, or the Jewish religious calendar, Passover is in fact the closest we get, I think, to reenacting, to remembering, to like first personing anything that happened into our spiritual lineage, into our spiritual ancestry. And it is incumbent upon us to keep asking the question, why do we want to remember this? Why do I want to reenact this? And is the way that I have been taught to reenact this, is the way that I've been taught to remember this actually the way that's most meaningful for me to do? And so the structure of the Seder and the structure of the Gada, I think, gives us that flexibility to keep asking those questions. And I think as long as we can keep asking those questions, as long as we find ourselves in communities, in families, in groups of practice that are open to exploring those questions rather than just assuming what is what should be, then I think Passover, and the Seder particularly, has the opportunity to continue to be this relevant piece of reimagining and re-understanding. But we've got to be able to keep asking that question year after year and looking for the answer, not just asking the question once and then being satisfied, or asking the question, maybe not finding an answer, and then just assuming that there is nowhere else to go with it.
So there's a lyric from a Bob Dylan song that popped into my head as you were asking your question, Lex, from the song Ballad in Plain D, where Dylan has this line, it's kind of irreverent, where he says, "My friends from the prison, they ask unto me, how good does it feel to be free? And I answer them most mysteriously, are birds free from the chains of the skyway?" And the reason I mention that is because I think this question of freedom, we can look at the world, we can see people who are not materially free. We can see people who are not free in their own consciousness. We can see people who appear materially free, but they don't feel free. I think there's no end to this question of how do we understand freedom? How do we embody freedom? How do we encounter it? How do we enact it? How do we help others to encounter it and enact it? To go back a little bit to the beginning of this conversation, some of the frustration I think all of us expressed about the Seder that's just recitation, that's just fulfilling a task. I sense that there's a shared idea that this time that we get, that the Jewish calendar invites us to use to really interrogate freedom within ourselves and in the world as it is right now, is a gift. And it so often feels like we're wasting the gift. And so when you talk about enactment mode versus observer mode feels like we're letting this gift pass us by. We're watching the pitch go by, and it's a strike. We just got to swing, and we can hit a home run, or get a base hit, whatever it is this year. We get to do it again every year. And I think it can be a way to set ourselves for a whole year, but even just for the 8 days of the holiday, if the Seder is successful, if we can even have a minute of that enactment, feeling those questions of what does it mean to be free? What does it mean to connect to each other? What does it mean to look at the world and try to pursue freedom, help others to become free? Then we're fulfilling the invitation. We're realizing the gift that our ancestors gave us.
I've been thinking about the Passover Seder as storytelling versus as something else. And what's occurring to me is that maybe the Seder has a kind of impoverished storytelling. And I'm wondering what you think as storytellers. But my sense is that the storytelling in the Haggadah is impoverished. And I think that the reason is that it was not meant to be read. It was meant to be a reminder, a set of reminders for people. And the story was meant to be told orally. the story was a story that was known to the person running the Seder, where it would just be natural to tell the kids, oh, here's the story. And because we are now experiencing it as a liturgy, as a read book, we don't think to do that. I think most people don't think to do that. Here and there, you do it if somebody is at the Seder and really doesn't know the story. And it makes me wonder whether we have an assumption that the technology that the Passover Seder is using is storytelling, when it actually isn't. The Passover Seder that we have now is actually doing something other than storytelling. I think the reason why people like it is because it's a time of getting together with family. I actually think people like the chance to go around and read. Not everybody likes to read, but I think that there's a notion that it's participatory. It takes place in the home, not the synagogue. And there are all kinds of things that people like about it. So when I go on a rant about how I have problems with the Seder, I feel bad that I'm yucking people's yum, that actually most people like it more than just about any other Jewish ritual. And yet, the thing that I'm missing is that I do think that there would be power in storytelling. And it's the difference between, watching a movie and reading the study guide to the movie. Basically, the Seder, the Haggadah, is the study guide to the movie, but actually we're never watching the movie. So I'm wondering, A, just for you to reflect on some of that as storytellers and to almost think about how might Judaism be even more powerful if we told more stories? And B, we've said before that maybe mucking around with the Seder isn't so likely to work out that well. Daniel, you alluded that there were some issues with this version of the Seder at your Seder, because people are kind of, for better or worse, I would argue for worse, kind of wedded to a certain expectation of what's going to happen at the Seder. And I've always kind of felt like, there are 6 or 7 other days of Passover, and maybe we can do interesting things on the other days, or maybe the day before. And I'm wondering, for example, Marques, when should people watch your show? Is it instead of the Seder? Is it the day before the Seder? Is it the day after the Seder? That feels to me like a storytelling experience. And Daniel, your Seder too. Maybe it would work better as an experience that people have not instead of the Seder, but somehow in addition to the Seder. So curious where you take that.
Well, I'd be happy with that. I think doing it in addition to the Seders would be great. Although we do 2 Seders in my family, so it always seemed like, why not do something interesting with the second one? And you're right. I think most Haggadahs don't tell the story, aside from my father was a wandering Aramean who went down to Egypt. And we're bored of that basic retelling. And the story itself, the text itself, is so rich. It's so good. There's so much.
Like the text in the actual Torah.
Yes. Yeah. I keep thinking of, I think it's Ruth Calderon who says you should walk barefoot through the text, come into encounter with the text, read it, get into it, really parse every sentence. And that's what the rabbis did. That's why it took them so long to have their Seders, why they stayed up till the morning Shema. And I would love to do more of that. Part of what I wanted to do was try to get the story back into the Seder. And I agree with you. I love going around the table and reading, but we're reading what feels like a formalistic legal story of how the Seder should be done and why we are doing the Seder this way. It's very meta. It's the cookbook. And we could be reading the story, and we could be engaging with the story. I think it doesn't have to be the Seder itself. We can preserve that as the tradition that it is. Although I think those traditions vary, and I think the people who you do the Seder with tend to vary over a lifetime. So I think there are opportunities to maybe try things in the Seder. That's what I tried to do.
Sort of my first thought with this idea that you were saying, Dan, about maybe we don't necessarily muck around with the Seder, it got me thinking about Thanksgiving and how every year, and I see this particularly around in Black communities, but I'm sure this is happens elsewhere too, where there's usually a PSA. And the PSA is, this is not the time to try a new recipe. Don't try a different recipe for mac and cheese. Don't try a different recipe for greens. If you made the sweet potato pie the same way for the last 15 years, do not change it now. And so holding that idea and thinking about this cookbook analogy and also just ingredients and thinking how those things go together. So let's pretend for a moment that we're going to sort of have Thanksgiving and Passover Seder sort of side by side for the sake of a comparison. If the edict is to not change the recipe, to not change the ingredients, what then do you still have left, right? You've got the reason why those are the ingredients. You've got the reason why that's the recipe. You have the story behind all of the little pieces that came to make up that meal. Even if we don't change anything about Seder, or if we don't try to do innovative things or uncomfortable things, there is still the story of how all of those things come together. And I remember in my first year, I think it was my first year of rabbinical school, we were looking at Mishnah Pesachim, sort of all of the rules and thoughts about Passover that the rabbis gave us, at least in that first go. And I said to my professor, because it didn't occur to me until that class, I was like, why don't we actually really talk about going from Egypt? Like, we've got this like abridged Cliff's Notes, outstretched arm and a mighty hand and all that jazz, but like we don't really actually get into this. And my professor said something to me. He said something akin to, well, in the rabbinic mind, they assume that you A, already know the story, and are B, already telling it. And it's that second assumption that I think is really interesting here. So even if you're doing, your standard family Seder, or standard community Seder, you still have license as the community of that story to tell it differently, to use the Haggadah as a jumping point or not, to author your own retelling of that liberation, that retelling of that Exodus. And I think that is something that is missing. And I don't know who that falls on. I don't know if it's like the fault of the Haggadah the Haggadot that we don't say that, or if it's something that like if more people knew that and understood that this book that we use was actually meant to be a jumping off point in the rabbinic imagination, because there are certain things that they assume that you are already doing. How might our standard seders look differently if everyone felt that they had that agency with that, air quotes, rabbinic authority behind it?
I mean, I think it'd look better for what it's worth. I do feel called to say, partially because this is my personal experience, but also because I think it's a lot of people's, I would venture a guess that more Seders than not in 2025 do tell the story of Moses being born and of Pharaoh looking to kill those baby boys, and then of Moses growing up, and then of Moses going to Midian and coming back, and then the plagues, and then the crossing the sea. I think we should be careful. I'm not correcting you. Like in the traditional Haggadah text, you don't do that. What I'd say positively about the vast corpus of Passover Haggadahs that have been written over the past long time, and also the ones that people are making themselves using things like Haggadot.com, I think people have come to the decision, whether they know that this is new or not, that you gotta tell the story. You gotta. There has actually been a collective Jewish finding that staying so meta and staying in that zone that Marques you were describing, where you only get the story of God used a mighty hand. Like, no, we actually have to say the what. Okay, we were slaves. Here's who was slaves. Their names were Moses and Miriam and Aaron, and there were a bunch of and here's what happened. So I'm happy about that. And I still think we're falling short, and I think it relates to this enactment versus lesson or observer piece. And I want to piss off all our listeners, or many of them, because I want to bring up transubstantiation. I want to bring up the Eucharist that Christians do, that I think relates to Passover. Because with the Eucharist, there's denominational debates and controversies around, is this bread and wine? Is it that it sort of represents, quote unquote, symbolizes Jesus's body and blood? Or is it actually Jesus's body and blood? I don't have a big stick in the game on that question. I do think that we do a problematic thing at Seders when we metaphorize everything, when everything is representing, everything is symbolizing, and not like this charoset is the bricks that we made. This salt water is the tears. It's got to be what's happening and not sort of a stand-in for what's happening. And I think that the Seders, we get meta because we think everything is metaphor. And that's why I'm so impressed, Daniel, by the choice to make it like we're experiencing. And so all of this is like, I think an implicit teaching of our Seder is that playing with your food is good, that experiencing symbolic meaning as real through tangible objects, through tastes, through bitterness, through hiding a piece of matzah somewhere in your house and playing a scavenger hunt. Like, all of these are play, and all of these are treating food as having like deep, real value in conveying how we want to be in the world. And so I kind of want to ask you, like, is there a particular moment in the Seder, the egg on the plate, the breaking of the matzah, the Hillel sandwich, I don't know, is there like a moment that you think is primed for us to maybe do better?
Well, I think the moment in the Seder that we actually do best, and I know this isn't exactly your question, is the 10 plagues, when we take a pinky and take the wine out of the glass. We are really taking wine out to lessen our joy. I'm going to hold that up as the example to try to emulate with other pieces of the Seder. So one piece that I added in to the Haggadah that we used was to really make Karpas the moment when we, the second generation, started to see the landscape change because we were getting closer to the Promised Land. So we have this moment to kind of represent spring, and we take the parsley and we dip it in the salt water, and that's all symbolism. I think that's all the kind of thing you're talking about as not ideal, as sort of creating a barrier between us and the story.
Well, I think doing the dipping is fine. It's just conceptualizing it as symbol versus like reality.
Right. So that is where, in my Haggadah, the invitation to start telling the story begins, because we're on the move. We start to see the landscape change. We start to see green. And when we start to see green, we need to remember that things weren't always green. We need to remember that things were hard. Let's go back and let's tell the story of our ancestors, because that's going to give us the wisdom to figure out what we do. Do we continue? Do we stay here where we know? And if we do continue, why? Why are we trying to go there?
In terms of thinking of like the moment that I feel like is really just like, oh, this is so impactful, is thinking actually about the maror, and particularly like spicy horseradish. I have been to different seders over the years where there's like, okay, here's like, if you're feeling brave, like here's the spicy one, here's the more mild like beet horseradish, or like these different sort of alternatives for it. That part of the reason why I'm really honing in on that is thinking about what you were saying, Lex, about this idea of transubstantiation. And this is my understanding of it, so if it might be slightly off, but I always understood it to be like, okay, like at this point, before you ingest these two objects are just that. They are bread and they are wine. And it is your ingesting of them, it is your digestion of those two items that then actually transforms them into the body and blood of Jesus Christ. That like your actual eating, your choosing to take it, is sort of integral in that transformation process. In holding that idea and thinking about haroset, or not haroset, goodness, maror, and the horseradish and what that represents, or what that is, the bitterness of that enslavement, but also it tastes kind of good, right? Like I'm thinking also about, I'm going to go on a little small side tangent, but like I think about like
we love horseradish at Judaism Unbound.
Fantastic. Well, it's like, okay, like let's say you get sushi somewhere, right? And you get that glob of wasabi. And you're like, oh yeah, like I want that wasabi. And you put that wasabi on your sushi and you were like, oh no, I've put too much on here and now my face is aflame and my sinuses are gone. But it tastes good. Like something in you wanted that. There's something about that was desirable. Where I'm getting at with this is there's actually a quote from Frederick Douglass that I want to bring into this. He says in his autobiography, I had the painful sensation of being about to separate from a circle of honest and warm-hearted friends. The thought of such a separation, where the hope of ever meeting again is excluded and where there can be no correspondence, is very painful. It is my opinion that thousands would escape from slavery who now remain there, but for the strong cords of affection that bind them to their families, relatives, and friends. And so when I think about maror as this is the pain of that slavery, this is the bitterness, this is the essence of what it meant to be enslaved, and then I think about this Frederick Douglass quote, even theoretically, there were families there, there were communities there, there are bonds. And so even in this culinary practice, for those of us who even like it a little bit, it's like, oh, there's also, we're maybe tasting some of that. We're maybe tasting some of that family, tasting some of that relativity, tasting some of that kinship that was forged in those fires of bondage. And I just really, I don't want to say I love holding those two things in tension with each other because it's hard, but it is really revelatory to me how when we talk about enslavement, whether it's like historical or spiritual, that we lose sight of the fact, or that it is easy to lose sight of the idea that, like, yeah, actually, like, people bonded. There were families, there were actual whole units of communities here. And in those communities, there was maybe a little sweetness. There was maybe a little bit of, okay, I've got you, my people, and I can keep enduring this because of this. And so I think that there is something really potent about the Maror moment in holding these ideas together.
I really have in the past thought about the Hillel sandwich this way, that really, if you think about the first part of the Seder, and I don't generally like to think about it this way, but if you think about the first part of the Seder as just symbols, then you can say, okay, it's almost like the, what do you call it at the beginning of a book? You know, there's like when it's like the dramatis personae, or the, you know, kind of like at the beginning it tells you these are all the characters that are going to come into the story later. And that, like, we're being introduced to all of these in the first part of the Seder. You know, here's the parsley and it stands for the springtime, and here's the salt water, it stands for our tears. And then in the Hillel sandwich, we put them all together and we eat it, and that is the transubstantiation. Like, then we're taking all those symbols and turning them into real, and then we're taking them into our body, turning into that freed slave. I think that's the transubstantiation. I mean, frankly, I think it's located in the wrong place because it's located right before you eat the rest of the meal. But I actually think it should be located right before the Magid part, the storytelling part, because wouldn't it be great if you just took all the symbols and then you took them into your body, and that was where you actually felt like a magical transformation. And now we're all actually that freed slave. And now we read the story. Now instead of reading the story that it's about them, we're reading the story that it's about us. The other thought that I wanted to share that I was occurring to me really, I think for the first time, was what if we think of the Seder as like an overture in a Broadway show, for example, where you have little parts of all the songs that are going to come later in the show. And we hear them all, but in a kind of unsatisfying way. And yet they're all tied together in a certain way. So there's value to it. But then it's much more powerful when we get into the show and we hear each of those themes in context, and we hear it with words, and we understand it as part of the story. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, so let's imagine that the Seder is an overture. And again, we have 6 or 7 more days of the holiday. So how might we design the other 6 days of the holiday to have pieces of what we currently think of as the Seder be the sole practice of that day, right? So like on day, you know, on the second day or the third day, whatever, after the Seders, you know, that's the day that I don't know, would we focus on the washing the hands? But maybe it would be one of the you know, that's where we focus on the karpas, on the springtime. And then, you know, the next day we focus on the maror, the bitterness, right? And that kind of thing. And I guess I'm asking you both to reflect on that, whether you think that's a good idea or not. And no pressure. You do not have to suck up to me. And then the other, as kind of like ritual designers, if that is a good idea, like how might that look? What might we do in terms of storytelling, in terms of ritual practice that would kind of let those pieces of the Seder become more powerful because we would experience each of them on its own?
Well, I think it would be great to have more containers for probing the story, probing our connection to freedom and to the questions that the story brings up throughout the holiday. It does feel like front-loaded Seders and then eat matzah for a week. What comes to mind is I do like the overture kind of framing. The Seders, you can think of them as it's the provocation to these areas that we want to put our attention on for the next week. And then my instinct is to bring it back to the story. The story is so big. It really does take up the whole book of Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy. Like we're Numbers. Forgot that one.
It's the best one.
That's the best one. It really is. And there are many, many stories in those books, many, many stories that aren't just the story of the Exodus, of being in Egypt and leaving, that we really focus on. Just thinking out loud here, I think if there were more opportunity in the subsequent days to kind of go and encounter some of the other stories, like maybe day 3 is about the building of the Mishkan, the tabernacle. Day 4 is about the spies. Day 5 is about
Golden calf.
The golden calf, of course, yeah. And hitting the rock. Moses hitting the rock. And Miriam getting leprosy. Like there are so many stories that are part of our myth, this grand myth that we carry, and we really focus on one tiny sliver of it for the Seder. But if we introduced them at the Seder, we might have opportunity to really probe at them over the subsequent days.
Dan, this idea of the Seder as overture is fascinating. I hadn't thought about it like this until you just said it, and it actually makes a ton of sense. Logistically, logically, it's like, oh wow, yeah, this is really the start, and we get this sampling, and then we just do whatever for the next 6 days, depending. And I'm thinking about 2 things. Well, 3 things, 2 things, something like that. So one of those things that I'm thinking about is, okay, so we have this like sliver of this liberation story, this liberation narrative, and then, it's literally the rest of Torah. Okay, cool. What does it then mean for the thing that precedes all of that to be the multiple attempts at creation and the multiple attempts at developing the lineage that this happens to? And is there a way to explore sort of those ideas together? Perhaps maybe like on the 5th day of Passover, we go to Bereshit and go to Genesis and start re-looking at about how we found ourselves in this mess in the first place. There's something really powerful to me just in thinking about both the length and the series of events that happen after we leave Egypt, or after we get from under sort of, the house of bondage. What happens after that? And then how we got into it in the first place. Maybe from a storytelling or ritualistic practice is, because on the second day of Passover, that's when we start counting, the Omer, the 49 days from the second night of Passover up to Shavuot. Like, what if part of an Omer counting practice was then zooming in on a portion of this story? Like, okay, like on this day, we're going to talk about Miriam. On this day, we're going to talk about the priestly garments and what the heck those are about and why we even care about them. On this day, we're going to talk about the spies. On this day, we're going to talk about, was it ethical or fair that this generation that endured so much did not get to actually go into the promised land? Counting the Omer practice feels, I think, like an interesting way into that.
Yeah, I love that.
I thoroughly agree. And there's almost like a fractal situation here, potentially. What I'm hearing from the two of you together. Or maybe it's like a place value thing with 1s, 10s, 100s, or it's like a different base because it's 7s, but like 1, 7s, 49.
Lexi, you should have rested with a sports analogy. I know you were so excited before. Like, no, we don't need math in the same episode.
No, but what we're saying is the Seder is like the littlest way of experiencing some of these things. Then we've got 7. I mean, the Seder is on one of it, but like overall we have 7 days or 8 of Passover, and so you could split up whether it's the other books of. Whether it's Exodus through Deuteronomy or it's specific portions of the story, you could get a deeper dive into them if you have 1 day for like each 1/7 of the story, and then you get a week for each one. Or I'm setting up that like we could use this scaffolding we already have as like, here's your overture in the way Dan said, or like mini overture, then overture, which is Passover. Like you get a 1 day taste, and then okay, you've prepped. Now you actually have a week on each of those. That's the Broadway show. That's like each song getting its full time, maybe. So I like that idea. I mean, I think that there's an interesting phenomenon where like when you ask people the message of the Talmud, like what's the wisdom of the Talmud? A lot of people don't, a lot of people don't know, but people who do know, they usually don't give a particular textual anything from the Talmud. What they say is like a meta message that argument is valuable. A Jewish thing to do is to argue with one another and to preserve dissenting opinions. That's kind of a really common understanding of like the value of the Talmud, or the value even of rabbinic Judaism generally that stems from the Talmud. But what's so interesting is when you ask folks about the Seder, you don't get a kind of meta message. I mean, we were criticizing meta in the sense of being outside the story. We should inhabit it. But I am embracing it because I think we should be noticing the implicit teaching of the Passover Seder, which to me, the biggest one is playing with your food generates sacred meaning. Like, to me, that's like that is something that infuses almost every single part of the Seder. You should dip it in stuff you don't usually dip it in. You should mix it in ways you don't usually. You should break it in a public way. You should hide it and play a game with your kids. Like, that is actually the core thing. And so I've actually been doing this. I might have said it on the podcast in past years, but like the last couple years, the way I've spent the remaining 7 days, because I'm already eating a limited number of foods and feeling annoyed about it, whatever, I've been playing with my food. And it's been like an abstract art project to try. Like, I've got my fruit slices from Manischewitz that like so many of us associate with Passover. They're actually a really different flavor palette and taste, but they're really sweet and they're like half circles.
No, we're not talking about actual fruit. We're talking about candy.
Sorry, the little half circle sour, they're not really sour, but like sort of sour. I don't know how you describe them, but those sugary things that are green and red and yellow and orange, turns out it's easy to play with those. And when you're trying to be like, okay, I just read this story and there's a bunch of stuff happening. Like, what if the fruit slices are part of the story now? I forget what I figured out in my food playing last year on the Tuesday between the beginning and end of Passover. But like, I figured out something and I enjoyed myself, and it helped me keep the spirit of Passover for more than just the Seders. And I bring up the fruit slices because I actually think those specific items are like in a lot of people's houses at this time and easy to play with. You could also play with the little macaroons. You could also play whatever you've got around counts. And I don't care to what extent you're keeping kosher for Passover. Play with any of it and try to generate meaning connected to the story we just experienced or the next stages in the story, like Daniel was saying. Like, to me, that's both fun and exciting. And I would argue it's an encapsulation of the core message of Passover. Because, like, we could have decided, it's cool to meditate once a year on freedom. It's cool to think about liberation, and it's even cool to tell a particular story from our history. But we made a specific choice to do that by playing with a bunch of foods and conjoining that play with some liturgical ideas. Like, because it's the water we're swimming in, we don't even notice we're swimming in it. But I would like to soak into that part of it with the remainder of the holiday. And so, of course, now, Dan, I'm going to turn it back to you because the three of us have gone. And maybe that's going to help us progress in this conversation.
Before Dan goes, Lex, I just want to respond really quickly because I think you're right about this core notion of play. And the piece that I want to add to it is the importance of questions in play. And even like the way kids tend to play oftentimes is by asking question after question after question. Well, why? And it's one of the reasons kids are the ones who say the 4 questions. That's an essential piece of play. And also it's possible because of this liberation, because we're free, we can play and ask questions and we can twist things around and change the story and retell the story and it's ours.
Yeah, and because you're a Daniel, you actually weren't interrupting. It's just retroactively I must have meant you, and now I'll mean the other Dan.
We have the same middle name too, by the way. So I think I've said something like this in past years, and I'll mention it because I still think it's kind of a good idea, but I'm really intrigued by the capacity to weave together a lot of what we've been saying. So my thought is some version of one day, only eat salad that day. That's the karpas. And then another day, only eat spicy foods or something. That's the maror. And a different day, only eat matzah. And of course, you can have water.
This is hardcore.
Well, and the reason that I originally had that idea, I think we talked about it on the podcast, was I was thinking that in my experience, Passover isn't powerful enough, hasn't been, to do the work that I imagine it doing, which is kind of focusing me on the implications of my freedom in terms of what I owe to others. In my thinking, fasting would be more powerful at doing that because fasting forces you to be conscious in a way that you're often not conscious, and that I would be asking myself all the time, why am I fasting? And if I kind of had a fast for 7 days, And by the way, parenthetically, I was thinking about it more as a Ramadan kind of fast where you can eat in the nighttime, but that you're fasting in a significant way for 7 days, like you're going to be doing a lot of thinking. And there was something that appealed to me about that, and it continues to appeal to me. And that if you could only eat matzah, or, maybe you could like you were fasting, except you were allowed to eat some matzah, like there would be something where that matzah would feel more significant than I feel like it generally does most of the time. The problem with my ideas here is that they're a little bit hardcore, they're a little bit rough, they're not so joyful, and they also don't kind of connect to stories in the way that you were talking about. So I'm really interested in a kind of ritualized version where there would be different things to eat on the different days. There would also be different stories for the different days. Those stories would tie to different ritual practices on those days. Like, I agree that the dipping your finger in the wine is just a really powerful example of how kind of a good story, a good message, right, and a good ritual practice all kind of tie together to make that very powerful. So I'm imagining we could have a really powerful practice like that for every day of Passover. And I really love the idea, Marcus, that you were talking about, that it itself would be the springboard. Alex, you were talking about this fractally, that Passover, the Seder would be the springboard for Passover, and Passover would be the springboard to Shavuot through the Omer. And, you have these kind of fractal springboards. And so I love that idea that it starts with the 7 days of Passover, and then there's 6 more weeks of 7 days, right, until Shavuot. And each of those weeks could be, whether it's a different manifestation, a different element, a different, orientation, or just the story extended over 49 steps, whatever it might be. I'm very intrigued by this. I think it would be really awesome.
Me too. That was a fun go-round. To close things out, Marcus and Daniel, what's a little nugget you want to leave our listeners with as they, prep their charoset, chop their veggies, do whatever they're doing today? I mean, if they're listening the day this comes out, the Seder is right here. It's just approaching. And if they're listening a little after that, the rest of the holiday is here. So what do you want to leave them with?
Thinking about Passover as the springboard to like counting the Omer, which gets us into Shavuot, and holding these, there are 2 particular teachings, right? One of like Shavuot, which is, when we celebrate, receiving the Torah, the revelation on Sinai, holding that rabbinic teaching that like every single one of us who was or would be received the Torah at Sinai at the same time. It's a beautiful rabbinic midrash. And so holding that on one hand, that we were all there when Torah was received, and then also thinking about this rabbinic command of, L'dor Hayav, like each person in every generation is commanded to see themselves as if they had gone forth from Egypt, and thinking about this relationship between the pursuit of freedom and the gift of revelation, and how those 2 things are coming together in this kind of fractal lead up idea. I think what I would like to leave folks with, to do what they can to find themselves, or insert themselves even actually, into the story, whether that is connecting a particular experience to one of the steps of the Seder, whether that is really thinking about what it means to have personal freedom and autonomy in our current climate, and sort of juxtaposing that with the story of our ancestors' liberation. Find a way in. Because as we've been talking about playing with our food and transubstantiation and what the actual role of consuming these objects actually does to us and for us, if you can find your way into the Seder, into the meal, into the Haggadah in some fashion, and then you have these foods, you ingest these foods, then that's going to kick off what I feel is a cycle of embodying that freedom, embodying that liberation, living into the revelation that's to come, just a few weeks later, in an on one foot sort of way. What I want to leave folks with, or what I invite folks to do, is to find and or insert themselves, if necessary, into this story and find a place where they fully see themselves in it.
The fact that the Seder is one of the few times, if not the only time, when we have this ritual for a holiday, and we have there isn't really any expectation that we go to synagogue, that we have mediation from some leader in the Jewish community. It's us with our families, with our friends, encountering our core myth. The idea that I really want to convey and leave people with is that this architecture that we've been given, even if it has felt unsatisfyingly filled in past years, is a real gift. And it's an opportunity to use that architecture to have these really important conversations about ourselves and the world in which we find ourselves right now, and who we are as a family, as a community, as friends, as a people. And because of the architecture as it is, because of that invitation to play that we've talked about, it doesn't have to be so somber and so serious and so hard to have that conversation. That's the piece that I worry that we don't use to its ideal effect. And I really want to invite people to embrace the play and bring themselves fully to it.
Thank you so much, Daniel and Marques, for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you guys.
And thanks so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you'll tune in again with us in the future. Chag Sameach, happy Passover. It is creepy crawling real close. It is literally starting tomorrow as this episode is released. And if you're listening a day after that, Passover starts this evening. And if you're listening a day after that, we're on the second day. And who knows? You could be midway through Passover. You could be at the end of Passover. You could even be after Passover. Regardless of where you are on the time scale, Chag Sameach, happy Passover. We do want to remind you, as Dan mentioned at the top, there are amazing post-Passover mini courses in the Onion Yeshiva that are available. There is a first block of 3-week mini courses that begin just as Passover ends, just after Passover ends. You can register at judaismunbound.com/classes. The 3 options. One of them is taught by me and our new program associate, Emma Newberry. That is called Moses, Tzipporah, and Us. It's all about powerful interfaith families from the Bible till the present. It's going to be very fun, and it's a perfect way to channel the very spirit of what we were talking about, learning about other parts of our Torah's flow, our Torah's story, as part of Passover and just after it. We have Untangling Tselem Elohim, the image of God, with Raphael Nice. We had an amazing episode midweek that came out that you can listen to learn more about that class. And we have Jewish Theology Unbound, Seeing God in Ourselves with Sophia Freudenstein. All great, great options. Financial aid is available for any of them. You can register again at judaismunbound.com/classes. And if you want more, that's very understandable. There are more mini courses that will be coming soon. They'll be posted for your registration in the near future. Those won't start till May, but you'll see them soon. So keep a lookout. We, of course, want to close by encouraging you to be in touch with us, and there are a wide variety of ways for you to do that. You can be in touch via Facebook or Instagram. Our handles are at Judaism Unbound. You can send us emails at dan@judaismunbound.com and or lex@judaismunbound.com. We are deeply, deeply grateful when you are able to support us financially with either a monthly recurring gift or a one-time donation. Either of those can be done at judaismunbound.com/donate. So thank you so much for listening. Chag Sameach, happy Passover. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.